The cold wind whipped through the dark alleyways of the city, biting at any exposed skin and whistling a mournful tune between the towering buildings. Nathan Cole pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his gaunt frame, seeking any semblance of warmth. His unshaven face was etched with lines of fatigue and sorrow, eyes haunted by memories he couldn't escape. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren were the city's lullaby, a constant reminder of the world that continued to spin without him. Once, Nathan had been a respected firefighter, a hero in the eyes of many. He had a modest home, a loving wife, and a purpose that filled him with pride. But that was before the fire, the one that changed everything. The inferno had consumed more than just the building. It had swallowed lives, dreams, and Nathan's very soul. He replayed that night endlessly in his mind. The crackling of flames, the screams for help, and the moment his confidence faltered, leading to a mistake that cost innocent lives. Now he wandered the streets aimlessly, each step heavy with the weight of his guilt. The city had a way of forgetting those who fell from grace, and Nathan preferred it that way. The anonymity of homelessness was his penance, a self-imposed exile from a life he no longer felt worthy of living. He avoided shelters and soup kitchens, choosing instead to scavenge and survive on the fringes, where he was less likely to be recognized. As dusk settled, Nathan found himself near the waterfront, the scent of brine mingling with the city's grime. He settled onto a bench overlooking the murky river, its surface reflecting the kaleidoscope of city lights. From his pocket, he pulled out a worn photograph. The edges frayed, the image faded. It was a picture of him and his wife, Emily, laughing on a sunny day in a park long forgotten. Her eyes sparkled with life, and his younger self looked carefree, unburdened by the shadows that now consumed him. "Emily," he whispered into the night air, his breath forming a faint cloud. She had tried to reach him after the accident, but he pushed her away, drowning in his despair. He couldn't bear the pity in her eyes or the possibility of tainting her life further. Eventually, she stopped trying, and he let her go, believing it was for the best. A sudden commotion snapped Nathan out of his reverie. Across the street, a couple of teenagers were arguing loudly, their silhouettes animated under a flickering street lamp. He watched as the confrontation escalated, but before it could turn violent, a patrol car pulled up, and the teens scattered into the labyrinth of alleyways. The brief disturbance settled, leaving the streets eerily quiet once more. Nathan stood up, tucking the photograph safely back into his pocket. It was time to find a place to rest before the real cold set in. He navigated through the maze of streets with the familiarity of someone who had walked them countless times. Eventually, he reached an abandoned building, a skeleton of concrete and steel that offered minimal shelter but was devoid of other squatters. Inside, the darkness was thick, but Nathan knew his way. He found his usual corner and settled down, using his backpack as a makeshift pillow. As he closed his eyes, the sounds of the city faded, replaced by the echoes of his past, the crackle of flames, the shouts of his team, and the moment he froze when it mattered most. Sleep did not come easily. It never did. His dreams were a relentless onslaught of memories and twisted scenarios where he was forced to relive his failures. Tonight was no different. He saw the faces of those he couldn't save, their eyes accusing, their hands reaching out to him before disappearing into the fire. He jolted awake, his heart pounding, sweat trickling down his brow despite the cold. Nathan sat up, running a trembling hand through his matted hair. The darkness pressed in around him, and for a moment, he felt as though he was back in that burning building, suffocating under the weight of smoke and guilt. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. But the words offered little comfort. The night stretched on, and he knew that sleep would evade him for the rest of it. As dawn approached, Nathan decided to leave the confines of the building. The early morning light cast a pale glow over the city, washing it in shades of gray. He made his way to a nearby park where a charity group often handed out coffee and stale pastries. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, grateful for the warmth of the beverage despite its bitter taste. "Rough night," a voice asked beside him. Nathan glanced over to see a man around his age, bundled in layers of mismatched clothing. It was Marcus, a fellow homeless individual he'd crossed paths with on occasion. Marcus had a friendly demeanor, his eyes sharp and observant. "Something like that," Nathan replied curtly. Marcus sipped his coffee. "Same here. Hard to get decent rest these days." Nathan nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. "You know," Marcus began cautiously, "there's a shelter uptown that's pretty decent. They don't ask too many questions." "I'm fine," Nathan said, perhaps too sharply. Marcus raised his hands defensively. "All right, suit yourself. Just thought I'd mention it." An awkward silence settled between them before Marcus sighed and stood up. "Take care of yourself, man." Nathan watched him leave, a pang of guilt twisting in his gut. Marcus was only trying to help, but accepting assistance felt like admitting he couldn't atone for his past on his own. He finished his coffee and decided to move on. The city was waking up, and the streets were beginning to fill with the hustle of people going about their lives. Nathan blended into the background, a ghost among the living. As he walked, he passed by a newsstand where headlines blared about political scandals and economic downturns. One article caught his eye. Mayoral candidate promises crackdown on homelessness. The irony was not lost on him. Politicians making empty promises without addressing the root causes, another reminder of a system that had failed so many. He continued down the street, the skyscrapers towering above like indifferent giants. The weight of the city pressed upon him, each step heavier than the last. Nathan wasn't sure how much longer he could continue like this, but the thought of seeking help was still too daunting. For now, all he could do was keep moving, one foot in front of the other, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to quiet the demons that haunted him. The sun peeked over the horizon, casting a golden hue on the glass facades of the city's skyscrapers. The morning rush had begun in earnest, with a sea of suits and briefcases flooding the sidewalks. Nathan weaved through the crowd, an invisible thread in the tapestry of the city's morning routine. The sharp contrast between his worn clothes and the polished attire of the commuters was stark, but no one spared him a second glance. He found himself drawn toward the financial district, a place he usually avoided. The opulence of the area was a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. Marble pillars, manicured plazas, and high-end boutiques lined the streets. Luxury cars idled at traffic lights, their drivers impatiently tapping fingers on steering wheels. As he turned corner, Nathan's gaze fell upon a massive digital billboard mounted on the side of a building. An image of Charles Bennett, a prominent politician and current mayoral candidate, filled the screen. With perfectly styled silver hair and a confident smile, Bennett exuded charisma. "Building a better future for everyone," the slogan read. Nathan scoffed under his breath. Politicians like Bennett spoke of unity and progress, yet the divide between the city's wealthy and its destitute only seemed to widen. He recalled the headline he'd seen earlier about cracking down on homelessness. The proposed policies often resulted in displacing the homeless rather than offering real solutions. Lost in thought, he didn't notice the woman walking briskly toward him until they collided. "Watch where you're going," she snapped, glaring at him as she steadied herself. "Sorry," Nathan mumbled, stepping aside. Her eyes flicked over his disheveled appearance with a mixture of disdain and discomfort before she hurried away, merging back into the stream of pedestrians. Nathan felt a flush of embarrassment and anger. He clenched his fists, resisting the urge to shout after her. Taking a deep breath, he looked around and realized he'd wandered further than usual. The buildings here were even more imposing, their reflective surfaces gleaming under the morning sun. He was an outsider in this part of town, a stark embodiment of the city's ignored underbelly. Nathan decided to head toward the waterfront, hoping the open space might offer some respite. As he approached the docks, the smell of salt water mixed with the city's smog. The area was less crowded, frequented mainly by tourists and joggers. He sat on a bench overlooking the bay, the gentle lapping of waves against the pier providing a soothing soundtrack. Seagulls swooped overhead, their calls cutting through the ambient noise. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. "Mind if I join you?" a voice asked. Startled, Nathan looked up to see an older man in a well-tailored suit. His eyes were kind, and he held 2 cups of coffee. Nathan hesitated. Sure." The man sat down, extending one of the cups toward him. "You look like you could use a warm drink." Nathan eyed him suspiciously. "What's the catch?" "No catch," the man replied with a gentle smile. "Just saw you sitting here and thought you might appreciate it." After a moment, Nathan accepted the coffee. "Thanks." They sat in silence for a while, watching the boats bob in the harbor. "Name's Edward," the man finally said, extending his hand. "Nathan," he replied, shaking it cautiously. Edward glanced at him. "You from around here, Nathan?" "Used to be," he said tersely. Edward nodded thoughtfully. "This city can be tough. It's easy to feel lost in all the noise." Nathan shot him a sideways glance. "You don't seem like someone who gets lost." Edward chuckled. "Appearances can be deceiving. Just because someone wears a nice suit doesn't mean they have it all figured out." Unsure how to respond, Nathan took a sip of the coffee. It was rich and warming, a small comfort he hadn't realized he missed. "Listen," Edward began carefully, "I don't want to pry, but if you're ever looking for work, I might know some people who could help." Nathan stiffened. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm fine." Edward raised his hands in surrender. No pressure, just putting it out there. An awkward silence settled between them. Nathan felt a mix of gratitude and irritation. Part of him wanted to accept any help that might pull him out of his current situation, but a stronger part resisted, clinging to his self-imposed punishment. Edward stood up. "Well, I should be going. It was nice meeting you, Nathan. Take care of yourself." "You too," Nathan muttered, watching as Edward walked away, merging into the crowd near the waterfront shops. He finished his coffee, contemplating the strange encounter. It wasn't often that someone showed him kindness without expecting something in return. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that accepting help would be a betrayal of his penance. As the day wore on, Nathan decided to head back toward the city center. He walked aimlessly, observing the ebb and flow of urban life. Street vendors called out to passersby, children laughed as they chased each other, and musicians played on street corners for spare change. He paused outside a grand hotel, its entrance adorned with ornate sculptures and velvet ropes. A line of black cars was parked out front, drivers waiting patiently. Nathan recognized the emblem on one of the vehicles. It was the same as the one he'd seen on the billboard earlier. Curiosity piqued, he lingered nearby. A group of well-dressed individuals exited the hotel, engaging in animated conversation. Among them was Charles Bennett himself. In person, the politician was even more commanding, his presence radiating authority. Nathan observed from a distance as Bennett shook hands and posed for photographs with admirers. The charisma was palpable, but so was the detachment. It was clear that Bennett moved in a world entirely separate from the common people he claimed to represent. As Bennett's entourage began to disperse, a young girl emerged from the hotel, clutching a stuffed animal. She ran up to Bennett, who scooped her into his arms with a genuine smile. "There's my little princess," he said warmly. Nathan realized this must be Bennett's daughter. The tenderness in the politician's eyes caught him off guard. It was a stark contrast to the polished public persona. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Nathan felt a pang of something akin to envy or regret. The simple display of familial love stirred memories of what he'd lost. He turned away, unwilling to confront those feelings. Continuing down the street, he found himself growing weary. The emotional toll of the day pressed upon him, and he sought the solitude of the less populated areas. As evening approached, the city's lights began to flicker on, casting a neon glow that reflected off rain-slicked streets. Nathan made his way back to the abandoned building he temporarily called home. The familiar shadows greeted him, and he settled into his corner. Despite his exhaustion, he knew sleep would be elusive. The day's events had stirred up too much inside him. He pulled out Emily's photograph once more, tracing her smile with his fingertip. "What am I doing?" he whispered into the darkness. A distant siren wailed, echoing through the night. Nathan closed his eyes, willing himself to find some semblance of peace. But as always, the memories lurked, waiting to invade his thoughts the moment he let his guard down. Tomorrow would be another day of the same, wandering through a city that wasn't his anymore, haunted by a past he couldn't change. Yet, somewhere deep within, a small voice questioned whether this was the life he was meant to lead, whether redemption was truly beyond his reach. The early morning haze blanketed the city, and Nathan wandered aimlessly, the concrete jungle both his prison and his sanctuary. His feet carried him with no clear destination, just as his mind drifted between past and present. The rhythmic sound of his boots hitting the pavement became almost hypnotic, like the beat of a distant drum calling him back to where it all went wrong. It was impossible to outrun the memories. They chased him relentlessly, whether his eyes were open or closed. Each day felt like an exercise in survival, not just from the cold and hunger, but from the torment within. The weight of guilt was suffocating, gnawing at him, and it didn't take much to send him spiraling back to that fateful night, the night that had forever changed the course of his life. He found a quiet alleyway and settled against the rough brick of a crumbling building. The sounds of the city faded into the background as his mind pulled him back into the inferno. It had been an ordinary call, a fire at an apartment complex, nothing out of the ordinary for a man who'd spent a decade battling flames. Nathan had rushed in with his team, their well-practiced routine unfolding like clockwork. They'd rescued a few families from the lower floors, securing a safe perimeter while the flames spread uncontrollably to the upper levels. But something went wrong. The building structure was unstable. The fire alarms hadn't gone off in time, and the smoke was thicker than usual. Something about faulty ventilation systems. His instincts told him to retreat, to regroup, and plan a safer way to handle the blaze. But protocol dictated they push forward, and against his better judgment, Nathan did just that. He could still hear the radio chatter, the crackling static as he barked orders to his team. The adrenaline surged through him, clouding his judgment. They moved floor by floor, but with every step, the fire grew stronger, more unpredictable. That's when the ceiling collapsed. His heart seized as a deafening roar echoed through the building, dust and debris raining down upon them. He should have called for a full evacuation then and there, but he hesitated. His pride, his ego, the parts of him that had earned him the nickname, the Unstoppable, refused to admit defeat. His team trusted him, and he couldn't let them down. But that decision, that moment of hesitation, sealed their fate. 2 of his men were trapped under the rubble, and by the time they managed to dig them out, it was too late. Their lifeless bodies haunted him every single night. Their faces burned into his memory. He'd failed them, failed their families. And as the building finally crumbled to the ground, Nathan emerged alive, but only in the physical sense. The man he once was had been buried in the ashes with his fallen comrades. The investigation afterward had been thorough. There were hearings, inquests, reports filed with meticulous detail. But no matter how many times he was told it wasn't his fault, that the building's safety violations had played a significant role in the deaths, it didn't matter. In his heart, he knew. He had hesitated. He had pushed forward when his instincts had screamed at him to stop. He had made the wrong call. His wife, Emily, had tried to comfort him, to tell him that he wasn't to blame. But the weight of his guilt drove a wedge between them. Nathan had pushed her away, convinced that anyone close to him would only suffer. And suffer she did. He had left her alone to deal with the aftermath, to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by tragedy. He wasn't strong enough to be there for her. He wasn't strong enough for anything anymore. The distant sound of a siren pulled him out of his reverie, bringing him back to the present. Nathan's hands were trembling, his breathing shallow. He clenched his fists, trying to ground himself, but the fire still raged in his mind, uncontrollable and relentless. Every time he thought he had escaped, it would pull him back in, like a vicious cycle he couldn't break. Wiping the sweat from his brow, Nathan stood up, trying to shake off the memory. He couldn't stay here forever, drowning in the past. But moving forward seemed impossible when every step felt like dragging a boulder behind him. What was he supposed to do? How could he ever make up for the lives he had taken with his recklessness? The sound of children playing nearby jolted him again. He glanced around the corner to see a small playground tucked between two apartment buildings. A group of kids, no older than 10, were chasing each other around the swings, their laughter filling the air. Parents watched from a distance, chatting amongst themselves. The scene was so peaceful, so normal. Nathan couldn't remember the last time he felt that kind of innocence. There had been a time when life had been simpler, when the weight of responsibility hadn't crushed him under its heel. But those days were long gone, swallowed by the fire. One of the children, a little girl with pigtails, fell off the swing, scraping her knee. She started to cry, and in an instant, her mother rushed over, gathering her into her arms, whispering soothing words. The child buried her face in her mother's shoulder, finding comfort and safety in her embrace. Nathan watched, feeling an unfamiliar ache in his chest. The tenderness, the care, things he had lost. Emily's face flashed in his mind, her tearful eyes the last time they had spoken. He had walked away from her without a word, knowing it was better for her if he disappeared from her life. But now, watching this small moment of love between mother and child, he questioned whether leaving had truly been the right choice. He tore his gaze away, unable to stand the sight any longer. He didn't deserve that kind of love, not after everything he'd done. Later that day, as the sun began its descent behind the city skyline, Nathan found himself near one of the wealthier districts again. The marble buildings loomed tall, their polished windows reflecting the amber glow of dusk. It was a part of the city he often avoided, but today, something drew him there. The street was lined with high-end cars and immaculate storefronts. People in tailored suits and designer dresses hurried in and out of luxury shops, completely oblivious to the world beyond their bubble. Nathan felt invisible here, just another shadow in a place that only saw light. He was about to turn away and head back toward the waterfront when he heard a commotion. A loud, frantic scream pierced the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Nathan's eyes darted toward the source of the noise, a high-rise apartment building several blocks away. Smoke. His heart skipped a beat. Thick, black smoke poured out from the upper floors of the building, curling into the evening sky like a serpent. The sight sent a cold shiver down Nathan's spine, but it also ignited something deep within him, something primal and buried. Without thinking, Nathan broke into a run. As he got closer, the scene unfolded into chaos. People were pouring out of the building's lobby, some coughing from the smoke, others shouting for help. The wail of sirens in the distance signaled the arrival of fire trucks, but they were still minutes away. Nathan's eyes scanned the crowd, trying to assess the situation. The fire seemed to have started on one of the higher floors, probably from faulty wiring or some other issue common in older buildings. But it was spreading fast, and the upper floors were still packed with people. "Help! My daughter is still up there," a man's desperate voice rang out from the crowd. Nathan turned to see a well-dressed man, his suit disheveled, his face pale with terror, frantically pointing toward the burning building. Nathan's stomach clenched. He recognized the man instantly, Charles Bennett. The politician's face was twisted in panic, his usual calm and composed demeanor completely shattered. He grabbed at the nearest firefighter, who had just arrived on the scene, begging for them to go back inside and save his daughter. But the fire was already too intense. Nathan's chest tightened. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to walk away, to let the professionals handle it. He had no business getting involved. He wasn't that man anymore. He wasn't a hero. But then, he heard it. The faint, terrified scream of a child trapped in the upper floors. Something snapped inside him. Without a second thought, Nathan pushed through the crowd and ran toward the building. The heat hit Nathan like a physical force as soon as he crossed the threshold into the lobby of the burning building. Smoke filled the air, choking him and clouding his vision. For a moment, panic threatened to take hold, his mind flashing back to that day, the collapsing ceilings, the screams of his men. But he shook it off, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. The lobby was chaos. People were still rushing toward the exits, some covered in soot, others carrying what few belongings they could salvage. A few firefighters were trying to organize the evacuation, but the blaze had already spread faster than anticipated. Flames licked at the walls, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning wood and plastic. Nathan's eyes darted toward the stairwell. The fire hadn't reached the lower floors yet, but the upper levels were engulfed in flames. There was no time to wait for backup. Every second counted. Without hesitation, he bolted toward the stairs, taking them two at a time. His body moved on autopilot, his instincts kicking in despite the years he'd spent running from this part of himself. The years of guilt, the memories of failure, everything faded in the face of the immediate danger. All that mattered now was getting to the child. As he ascended, the temperature rose with each floor. Sweat dripped down his face, and his lungs burned with each breath of smoke-filled air. But he pushed forward, ignoring the protests of his body. He had no time to slow down, no time to hesitate. Not again. By the time he reached the 10th floor, the heat was unbearable. Flames crawled across the ceiling, and the walls were starting to buckle under the pressure. But Nathan could still hear the faint cries of the child, a little girl, trapped somewhere beyond the smoke and fire. "Where are you?" he called out, his voice hoarse from the smoke. He strained to hear above the roar of the fire, hoping for some kind of response. There, a soft whimper coming from the far end of the hallway. Nathan dropped to his knees, crawling beneath the thick layer of smoke that hung in the air. His heart raced as he reached a door, its surface hot to the touch. He kicked it open with a swift motion, praying the flames hadn't reached the room inside. Through the haze, he spotted her, a small figure curled up beneath a desk, clutching a stuffed animal. Her eyes were wide with terror, tears streaking down her soot-covered face. "Hey, it's okay," Nathan said, keeping his voice as calm as he could. "I'm here to get you out of here." The little girl didn't move, frozen by fear. Nathan crawled toward her, gently pulling her out from under the desk. She clung to him, her small body trembling. "What's your name?" he asked as he scooped her into his arms, trying to keep her talking and calm. "Lily," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. "All right, Lily," he said, standing up and holding her close. "I need you to be brave, okay? We're going to get out of here, but I need you to hold on tight." She nodded, her tiny hands gripping his shirt as he turned back toward the door. The hallway was even worse now. The flames had spread, and the air was almost unbreathable. Nathan could feel the heat on his skin, but he pushed through, his only thought on getting Lily to safety. He made his way back toward the stairwell, but just as he reached the door, there was a deafening crack. The ceiling above them gave way, collapsing in a shower of debris and flame. Nathan barely had time to react, diving to the side and shielding Lily with his body as the rubble crashed to the floor beside them. For a moment, everything went still. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest, his ears ringing from the explosion. He coughed, choking on the thick smoke that filled the air. His body ached, but a quick assessment told him that both he and Lily were unharmed. But they were trapped. The stairwell was completely blocked by the debris, and the flames were closing in from both sides. Nathan's mind raced, trying to find another way out. He couldn't risk the elevators, not in a fire like this. His only option was to find another staircase, or if worst came to worst, a window. He looked down at Lily, who was still clinging to him, her face buried in his chest. She was terrified, but she wasn't crying. That, at least, was something. "All right, Lily," he said, adjusting his grip on her. "We're going to take a little detour, okay?" She nodded silently, and Nathan turned back down the hallway, heading in the opposite direction. He remembered seeing a fire escape on the side of the building when he first arrived. If they could just make it there, they'd have a chance. But the fire was spreading fast. The walls were groaning under the pressure, and every step felt like a race against time. Nathan's legs burned with the effort, his muscles screaming in protest. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He reached the end of the hallway and spotted the door to the fire escape. Relief flooded through him as he pushed it open, the cool night air rushing in to meet him. But his relief was short-lived. The fire escape was gone, completely torn away from the side of the building, likely during the collapse of the upper floors. Below him was a sheer drop to the alleyway far below, and there was no way he could make the jump with Lily in his arms. Panic clawed at Nathan's chest, but he forced it down. He had to think. There had to be another way. He turned back to the hallway, his eyes scanning the smoke-filled corridor. The flames were getting closer, and the building was groaning under the strain. They were running out of time. Then he spotted it. A window at the far end of the hallway, leading to the adjacent building. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. "Hold on, Lily," he whispered, adjusting his grip on her as he sprinted toward the window. He reached it just as the flames closed in, the heat singeing his back. With a desperate shove, he threw open the window and climbed onto the narrow ledge outside. Below him was a narrow alley, and across from him was a neighboring building, just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles. Nathan took a deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. "All right, Lily," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We're going to jump, okay? I need you to hold on tight." She nodded, her grip tightening around his neck. Nathan glanced down at the alley below, his heart pounding. One misstep, and they wouldn't make it. But there was no other option. With a deep breath, Nathan launched himself across the gap. For a split second, they were weightless, suspended in the air between the two buildings. Time seemed to slow as they sailed over the alleyway, the roar of the flames fading into the background. Then they hit the opposite building with a hard thud. Nathan grunted in pain as his body slammed against the wall, but he held on, his fingers gripping the window ledge. With a final heave, he pulled himself and Lily through the window and into the safety of the adjacent building. They were safe, for now. Nathan collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. His body ached, his lungs burned, but they had made it. He glanced down at Lily, who was still clinging to him, her wide eyes staring up at him in awe. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Nathan smiled weakly. "We did it." But even as the relief washed over him, he knew this was far from over. The fire was still raging, and they were only one building away. They needed to get out of the area, and fast. But for the first time in a long time, Nathan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Nathan's heart was still pounding in his chest as he sat in the safety of the adjacent building, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His body ached from the strain, and every muscle screamed in protest, but there was no time to rest. They were still far from safety, and the fire next door was raging out of control. The flicker of hope he had felt moments ago was quickly replaced by the familiar, gnawing fear. His mind raced back to the fire that had taken everything from him, the one where he had made the wrong call, the one where 2 men had died because of him. The images played on a loop in his mind, the collapsing ceiling, the panicked radio chatter, the deafening roar of the flames. He had hesitated. He had made a mistake. And now, here he was again, in the middle of a fire, responsible for someone's life. He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. This wasn't the time to lose himself in the past. He had to focus on the present, on getting Lily to safety. But the memories were relentless, pulling him under, drowning him in guilt. Nathan closed his eyes, willing himself to focus. He couldn't let this happen again. He couldn't afford another mistake. The adjacent building offered some temporary respite, but the heat from the fire next door was starting to seep through the walls. Nathan knew they couldn't stay there for long. His breath was still labored, and the heavy weight of his past was dragging him down, but Lily was depending on him. He couldn't afford to fall apart. Glancing out the window, Nathan took stock of their surroundings. They were on the same floor as the fire, but this building, though older, hadn't yet been touched by the flames. He needed to get Lily to a lower floor, away from the heat and smoke. "Stay close to me, okay?" Nathan whispered to Lily, his voice still raspy from the smoke. The little girl nodded, her wide eyes filled with trust and fear. She hadn't spoken much since they jumped to safety, but her grip on his hand was firm. The building was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Nathan led Lily through the darkened hallways, listening for any sounds that might indicate the fire was spreading their way. Every now and then, he paused, his head tilted, ears straining to hear the crackle of flames or the groaning of wood under pressure. The stairwell was their best bet, but Nathan was cautious. If the fire had made it to this building, they could easily find themselves trapped again. His mind raced, assessing the situation, mapping out possible escape routes. Years of firefighting instincts kicked in, though they were rusty from disuse. When they finally reached the stairwell, Nathan hesitated. He opened the door slowly, wincing as the hinges creaked loudly in the stillness. The stairwell was dimly lit by emergency lights, casting long shadows on the walls. It was clear for now, but Nathan knew how quickly that could change. "We're going to go down, but we have to move quickly," Nathan told Lily, crouching down to her eye level. "Stay right behind me and don't let go of my hand, okay?" She nodded again, her grip tightening on his fingers. Nathan took a deep breath, then started down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. Each step brought them closer to safety, but also closer to the unknown. The lower floors could be blocked, or worse, already overtaken by fire. As they descended, Nathan's mind was in constant overdrive. He calculated how much time they might have before the flames reached them, weighed their options in case the stairwell became impassable, and tried to suppress the nagging voice in his head that reminded him of the last time he had been in this situation. They reached the 5th floor when the unmistakable smell of smoke began to fill the air. Nathan froze, instinctively pulling Lily back against the wall. His heart raced as he glanced down the stairwell, where a thin trail of smoke curled up from below. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. The fire had already spread further than he anticipated. Nathan knew they couldn't risk going any lower. The fire was moving too fast, and they'd be caught in the middle if they tried to outrun it. His mind raced for alternatives. He scanned the 5th floor landing, looking for anything that could provide an escape route. The emergency exit plan on the wall caught his eye. According to the map, there was a service elevator on this floor that led directly to the parking garage. It was a long shot, but it might be their only chance. Nathan motioned for Lily to follow him as he pushed open the door to the 5th floor. The hallway was filled with a light haze of smoke, but it was still manageable. The service elevator was located at the far end of the hall, past a series of storage rooms and maintenance areas. They moved quickly, keeping low to avoid the smoke. Nathan's eyes burned, and his throat was raw from inhaling the toxic air, but he forced himself to push through the discomfort. Every step felt like a gamble, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. When they finally reached the service elevator, Nathan hesitated again. There was no telling if the elevator still worked, or if it was safe to use during the fire. But with the stairwell quickly becoming impassable, they didn't have many options left. He pressed the button, praying the elevator hadn't been shut down as part of the fire safety protocols. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low hum, the elevator doors creaked open. Relief washed over Nathan as he ushered Lily inside. The interior was old and dingy, with flickering lights casting an eerie glow, but was their best shot at escaping the building. Nathan hit the button for the parking garage, and the doors slid shut with a groan. The elevator jerked to life, descending slowly as the sound of the fire raged above them. Nathan leaned back against the wall, his body sagging with exhaustion. He glanced down at Lily, who was still clutching his hand tightly, her face pale but determined. "You're doing great," Nathan said softly, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "We're almost out of here." Lily nodded, though she didn't speak. The weight of the situation was clearly taking its toll on her, but she was holding up better than Nathan could have ever expected. As the elevator descended, Nathan allowed himself a moment to breathe, to regroup. His mind replayed the last hour over and over, his decision to enter the building, the jump to safety, the stairwell filling with smoke. It had all happened so fast, and yet In the midst of it all, Nathan had felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. It was fleeting, fragile, but it was there. For the first time since the fire that had destroyed his life, Nathan felt like he was doing something that mattered. He was saving someone, and that gave him a sense of worth he hadn't known he was still capable of feeling. But the past still loomed large. The memories of his failure, the lives lost because of his mistake, it was all still there, lurking in the corners of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was running from something, even as he fought to save Lily. The elevator came to a stop with a jolt, and the doors slid open, revealing the dimly lit parking garage. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. They had made it out of the building, but they weren't out of danger yet. The fire was still raging above them, and the garage was filled with the distant sounds of collapsing structures. He stepped out of the elevator, pulling Lily along with him. The air was clearer down here, though the acrid scent of smoke still lingered. They needed to get out of the area entirely, away from the fire, away from the collapsing buildings. "Come on," Nathan said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to keep moving." They made their way through the parking garage, the echo of their footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls. The further they went, the more distant the sounds of the fire became, but Nathan remained on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in danger, that something was waiting for them just beyond the next corner. When they finally emerged into the open air, Nathan breathed a sigh of relief. They were outside, far enough from the building to be out of immediate danger. The fire was still burning, and the smoke billowed into the night sky, but they were safe. For now. Nathan knelt down, pulling Lily into a tight hug. "You did great," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You were so brave." Lily didn't say anything, but her small arms wrapped around his neck, holding him close. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, and Nathan allowed himself to feel something other than guilt, something other than the weight of his past. He had saved her, but as he held Lily, his eyes wandered to the street beyond, where the flashing lights of fire trucks and ambulances lit up the night. And there, standing at the edge of the chaos, was Charles Bennett, the politician whose daughter he had just saved. Bennett's eyes met Nathan's across the distance, and in that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding, a connection that neither man fully understood. But as Nathan stood, pulling Lily to her feet, he couldn't help but feel that this was far from over. Nathan stood frozen for a moment, watching as Charles Bennett slowly made his way through the crowd, his eyes locked on Nathan and Lily. The politician looked disheveled, his suit jacket askew, his tie loosened, and his usually polished demeanor replaced by the raw emotion of a father whose worst nightmare had just been narrowly avoided. Lily had been saved, but the fire still raged behind them, and the building continued to crumble. Emergency responders swarmed the scene, and the air was thick with the sounds of sirens, radio chatter, and the distant roar of flames. As Bennett approached, his eyes flicked down to his daughter. His face softened with a mix of relief and disbelief. "Lily," he breathed, kneeling down to her level and pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, silent but clearly shaken. For a long moment, the world around them seemed to fade, and all that existed was the father and his child, reunited in the wake of disaster. Nathan watched from a few feet away, his emotions tangled. Relief washed over him. He had done what he came to do. Lily was safe. But as he watched Bennett embrace his daughter, the weight of everything he had lost came crashing down on him. He had once had a family, someone to come home to, someone to hold close after the darkness of the world closed in. And he had walked away from it all. Bennett stood, holding Lily close, his eyes still focused on Nathan. The gratitude was evident, but so was the confusion. This man, the one who had saved his daughter, didn't belong in the polished world Bennett inhabited. Nathan was a ghost, a remnant of the city's unseen underbelly, and yet he had been the one to pull Lily from the flames. Bennett took a step forward, his voice hoarse from emotion. You saved her." Nathan shrugged, not knowing what to say. The words fell hollow. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it because in that moment, There was no other option. Lily needed saving, and he had been there. That was all there was to it. But Bennett wasn't satisfied with silence. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone soft but urgent. "How did you get into the buildings?" Nathan hesitated, glancing around at the chaos still unfolding around them. Firefighters were working tirelessly to control the blaze, and paramedics rushed to help the injured. This wasn't the time for explanations, and besides, what could he say? That he was a washed-up former firefighter who had once been someone important, but now lived in the shadows of the city. Before he could respond, a paramedic approached, interrupting the conversation. "Sir, we need to check on both of you," she said, gesturing toward Nathan and Lily. "You've both been exposed to a lot of smoke. We need to make sure you're okay." Nathan waved her off, shaking his head. "I'm fine. Focus on her." But the paramedic insisted, gently guiding them toward the makeshift medical tent that had been set up nearby. Bennett followed, still holding Lily tightly, his eyes never leaving Nathan. The questions lingered in the air, unanswered but ever present. As they approached the tent, Bennett finally spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You're not a firefighter, are you?" Nathan froze, his throat tightening. He wasn't sure how to answer, but Bennett didn't wait for him to respond. The politician's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "I've seen you before," Bennett said, his voice soft but certain. "In the streets, near City Hall." Nathan swallowed hard, the tension building in his chest. Bennett knew. He wasn't just a nameless stranger anymore. He was one of the forgotten, one of the many who had slipped through the cracks of the very system Bennett claimed to fight for. Before the conversation could go any further, a paramedic ushered Lily and Bennett into the tent, separating them from Nathan. The distance between them felt like a reprieve, a chance for Nathan to escape before the questions became too much. He turned to leave, his feet already carrying him away from the chaos, but a voice stopped him in his tracks. "Wait." Nathan turned to see Bennett standing just outside the tent, his expression unreadable. The man took a step forward, his eyes filled with something Nathan couldn't quite place. Gratitude, confusion, guilt? "Don't go," Bennett said quietly. "We need to talk." Nathan hesitated, every instinct in him screaming to walk away, to disappear back into the shadows where he belonged. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the weight of the moment, the significance of what had just happened, or maybe it was the flicker of hope that still burned inside him, faint but persistent. He nodded once, reluctantly, and followed Bennett into the tent. Inside the medical tent, the air was thick with tension. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered, casting a cold, sterile glow over everything. Paramedics moved quickly, tending to the injured and checking vitals, but the world seemed to slow as Nathan followed Charles Bennett further into the tent. The enormity of what had just happened was sinking in, and Nathan's mind raced, struggling to process it all. Lily was seated on a small cot, her face still streaked with soot, but otherwise unharmed. She clutched her stuffed animal tightly, her wide eyes following Nathan's every movement. The gratitude in her gaze was unmistakable, but it was also mixed with something Nathan couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or awe. Bennett sat beside her, his expression a mixture of relief and confusion. He hadn't let go of her hand since they'd reunited, and it was clear that the politician's usual veneer of control had been shattered by the day's events. He looked different now, more human, more vulnerable. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, feeling out of place in the tent, surrounded by professionals and people who still had lives to return to. He was used to the streets, where no one asked questions, where he could exist without being seen. But now Bennett had seen him, truly seen him, and Nathan wasn't sure how to handle it. "Look, I don't know what to say," Bennett began, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my daughter's life. There's nothing I could ever do to repay you." Nathan shrugged, glancing away. "I didn't do it for you." The words came out sharper than he intended, but he didn't regret them. He hadn't rushed into that burning building for recognition, and he certainly hadn't done it for Bennett. He had done it because he couldn't stand by and let another innocent life be lost, not when he had the chance to prevent it. Bennett looked taken aback, but he didn't argue. Instead, he studied Nathan as though trying to figure him out, to make sense of how a homeless man had ended up being the hero of the day. "Why were you there?" Bennett asked, his voice quieter now. "Why were you in that building?" Nathan met his gaze, his jaw tightening. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, the memories of the fire that had destroyed his life flashing in his mind. But how could he explain that? How could he make Bennett understand the guilt, the shame, the need for redemption that had driven him into that building? "I don't know," Nathan said finally, his voice low. "I just did what I had to do." Before Bennett could respond, the flap of the tent rustled, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Nathan's heart sank as he recognized Marcus, his friend from the streets. Marcus looked around the tent, his eyes landing on Nathan with a mixture of concern and relief. "There you are," Marcus said, walking over to him. "I've been looking everywhere for you, man. When I saw the fire, I thought—" Nathan shook his head. "I'm fine. We got out." Marcus nodded, glancing warily at Bennett and Lily before turning his attention back to Nathan. "You're lucky. That building could have come down any second." "I know." Marcus' eyes lingered on Bennett for a moment longer, clearly unsure of the situation. The contrast between Nathan's two worlds, the wealthy, polished world of the politician and the gritty, unforgiving world of the streets, felt sharper than ever. Marcus had been a constant in Nathan's life ever since he had found himself homeless, and there was a comfort in their shared struggles. But now, standing in this tent, surrounded by people who didn't belong in their world, Nathan felt the distance growing. Bennett stood, his gaze shifting between Nathan and Marcus. "You two know each other." Marcus crossed his arms, his posture defensive. "We've been through some things together, yeah?" Bennett nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, a paramedic approached, interrupting the conversation. "We need to move you all out of here," the paramedic said briskly. "The fire's still spreading, and the structural integrity of the building is compromised. It's not safe to stay." Nathan exchanged a glance with Marcus, who gave him a slight nod. It was time to leave. The chaos of the fire had brought them together, but now it was time for everyone to return to their respective lives, however different those lives might be. Bennett hesitated, then turned to Nathan. "Look, I want to help you. Both of you." His gaze flicked to Marcus for a moment before returning to Nathan. "I don't know what your situation is, but I can make sure you're taken care of. You don't have to live like this." Nathan stiffened, the offer hanging in the air like a bitter pill. He had heard promises like that before. Offers of help from people who had no idea what it was like to live on the streets, to carry the weight of guilt and failure every day. Bennett meant well, but Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that accepting his help would mean surrendering something vital, something he wasn't ready to give up. "I don't need your charity," Nathan said quietly, his voice firm. Bennett frowned. "It's not charity. You saved my daughter's life. This is the least I can do." Marcus stepped forward, his tone defensive. He said he doesn't need it. The tension in the tent escalated as the two worlds clashed. Bennett, with all his power and resources, couldn't understand why someone would refuse his help, while Marcus, hardened by years on the streets, saw the offer as another empty promise. Nathan held up a hand, cutting off the brewing argument. "It's fine, Marcus. Let's just go." Bennett looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. He stepped back, watching as Nathan and Marcus turned to leave the tent. Lily's soft voice broke the silence as they walked away. "Thank you," she whispered, her small voice carrying across the distance. Nathan didn't look back, but the words lingered in his mind as they made their way out of the chaos and into the night. The streets were quiet as Nathan and Marcus walked away from the scene of the fire, the weight of the day pressing heavily on their shoulders. The distant wail of sirens and the glow of the burning building faded behind them, replaced by the familiar sounds of the city at night. They didn't speak for a long time, both lost in their own thoughts. Nathan's mind was racing, replaying everything that had happened. The fire, Lily's rescue, the encounter with Bennett. It all felt surreal, like a dream he couldn't quite shake off. "You okay?" Marcus finally asked, breaking the silence. Nathan nodded, Though the truth was far more complicated than a simple yes or no. He was physically exhausted, his body still aching from the exertion of the rescue, but was the emotional toll that weighed heaviest. The fire had dredged up memories he had spent years trying to bury, and now they were clawing their way to the surface, refusing to be ignored. "I'll be fine," Nathan said, his voice low. "Just need some time." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That was a hell of a thing you did back there." Nathan didn't respond. He didn't know how to feel about what he had done. Part of him was proud that he had been able to save Lily, proud that he hadn't hesitated this time. But another part of him, the part that carried the guilt of his past, couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't deserve any of it. He had failed before, and no matter how many lives he saved now, it wouldn't erase what had happened. They turned a corner, heading back toward the part of the city they called home. The streets were quieter here, the bright lights of the wealthier districts replaced by dimly lit alleyways and graffiti-covered walls. As they walked, Marcus glanced at Nathan, his expression unreadable. "You think Bennett's offer was serious?" Nathan shrugged. "Doesn't matter." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean, it doesn't matter? The guy's a big shot. He could actually help us." "I don't need his help," Nathan said, his tone sharp. Marcus stopped walking, turning to face him. "Why not? You've been out here longer than I have, man. We could get off the streets. We could get our lives back." Nathan met Marcus' gaze, his jaw clenched. "Well, life. This is my life now." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "It doesn't have to be." Nathan started to walk again, not wanting to continue the conversation. But Marcus' words echoed in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried to push them away, they stayed with him. It doesn't have to be. The problem was, Nathan wasn't sure he believed that. He had spent so long punishing himself, living in the shadows, that he didn't know if he could ever find his way back to the light. As they neared the abandoned building where they usually stayed, Marcus suddenly stopped, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something in the distance. Nathan followed his gaze, his stomach sinking when he saw what Marcus had noticed. There, near the entrance to the building, stood a group of men. Nathan recognized them immediately, other homeless men they had crossed paths with before, but these men weren't like Marcus or Nathan. They were trouble. One of the men, a tall figure with a scar running down the side of his face, spotted Nathan and Marcus and stepped forward. His smile was anything but friendly. "Well, well," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "Look who decided to show up." Nathan's heart sank. He had hoped to avoid this kind of confrontation tonight, but seemed fate had other plans. Nathan's pulse quickened as the tall figure with the scarred face approached, flanked by two other men who seemed all too eager for trouble. The streets had taught him to stay out of sight, to avoid situations like this whenever possible. But tonight, there was no escape. He could feel Marcus tense beside him, readying for whatever might come next. "Looks like you've been making yourself scarce," the man said, his voice dripping with hostility. His eyes flicked between Nathan and Marcus, the smirk on his face growing wider. "We've been waiting for you." Nathan knew the type. Men who had been hardened by the streets, just like him, but who had turned that hardness into something cruel. They thrived on power and intimidation, preying on those who were weaker or more vulnerable. He had seen it before, and he had done his best to avoid them. But tonight, it seemed there was no avoiding the confrontation. "We don't want any trouble," Nathan said evenly, his voice calm but firm. His eyes scanned the street, looking for an escape route or a way to defuse the situation. The scarred man let out a low chuckle. "Trouble? You're already in it, buddy. You've been living on our turf for weeks now, and you think you can just waltz back in here like nothing happens." Nathan's jaw tightened. He hadn't realized these men were staking any sort of claim on the area. In the world of the homeless, territories were often unspoken but deeply understood, and crossing those lines could lead to serious consequences. He cursed himself for not paying closer attention to the signs. "We didn't mean to intrude," Marcus spoke up, his voice wary but steady. "We've just been trying to survive like everyone else." "Survive?" the man sneered, taking a step closer. "You think this is about survival? You've got it all wrong. This is about respect." Nathan could feel the tension rising. The man's friends were closing in, their eyes gleaming with malice. It was clear they wanted to escalate the situation, to make an example of Nathan and Marcus. But Nathan wasn't interested in fighting. Not tonight. Not after everything that had happened. "We'll leave," Nathan said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "We didn't know this was your territory. We'll find somewhere else." The scarred man's smirk faltered, just for a moment. He had been expecting a fight, not a retreat, and Nathan's calm response seemed to throw him off balance. But the reprieve was short-lived. The man's expression hardened again, and he stepped forward until he was inches from Nathan's face. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he hissed, his breath hot against Nathan's skin. "You don't get to walk away. Not after you've been freeloading on our streets." Nathan clenched his fists at his sides, resisting the urge to strike back. He had dealt with men like this before, men who thrived on control, who needed to assert their dominance over anyone they saw as a threat. But he couldn't afford to get into a fight. Not here. Not now. "I'm not looking for trouble," Nathan said again, his voice low and steady. "But if you want to fight, you'll get one." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The scarred man's eyes narrowed, and his muscles tensed, ready to lash out. Nathan braced himself, his body coiled like spring, prepared for whatever might come next. But before anything could happen, a voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." The command was sharp and authoritative, and it came from behind the group. Nathan turned to see a new figure approaching, a tall man with a weathered face and an air of quiet authority. He walked with purpose, his shoulders squared and his eyes cold as they swept over the scene. The scarred man took a step back, his sneer fading into something closer to fear. "Riley," he muttered, his voice suddenly subdued. Riley stopped in front of the group, his gaze settling on Nathan. "What's going on here?" "They've been squatting on our turf," the scarred man said quickly, eager to shift the blame. "We were just reminding them of the rules." Riley's expression didn't change. He looked from the scarred man to Nathan, then back again. "The streets aren't yours to claim," he said quietly, but there was a steel in his voice that made it clear he wasn't to be argued with. "You don't own anything here." The scarred man opened his mouth to protest, but Riley silenced him with a look. "Get out of here," he said, his voice calm but commanding. Now, for a moment, it seemed like the scarred man might argue. But then, without another word, he turned and slunk away, his two friends following closely behind. Nathan watched them go, his heart still racing, but relief washing over him. Riley turned back to Nathan and Marcus, his expression unreadable. "You're lucky I came by when I did," he said, his tone neutral. "They've been looking for an excuse to pick a fight." Nathan nodded, grateful but wary. He didn't know Riley, but it was clear he had some sway over the streets. "Thanks," Nathan said, his voice quiet. Riley studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I don't get involved in fights unless there's something in it for me." Nathan's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" Riley shrugged. "Let's just say I keep an eye on things around here, and I've noticed that you've been getting into some interesting situations lately." Nathan's stomach twisted. He didn't like where this conversation was headed. "You helped save Bennett's daughter," Riley continued, his voice low. "That's no small thing. But now you've got his attention, and that's dangerous. Guys like him don't mix with guys like us." Nathan's mind raced. Riley was right. Bennett's world was miles away from theirs, and Nathan had no intention of crossing that line again. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too deep to turn back. "What are you saying?" Nathan asked, his voice tight. Riley gave him a long, hard look. "I'm saying that you need to be careful. People like Bennett don't help guys like you without expecting something in return. He'll come calling, and when he does, you'd better be ready." Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. He had refused Bennett's offer, but Riley's words echoed in his mind. There was no walking away from someone like Charles Bennett, not after what had happened. He was already entangled in a world he had no business being part of. Riley's eyes softened, just for a moment. "You seem like a decent guy," he said quietly. Don't let him ruin you." With that, Riley turned and walked away, leaving Nathan and Marcus standing in the middle of the street, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. What the hell was that about? Nathan didn't answer right away. His mind was still spinning from everything that had happened, from the confrontation with the scarred man to Riley's warning about Bennett. The world felt like it was closing in on him, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure where he stood. "I don't know," Nathan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think we're in over our heads." The days that followed the fire were a blur for Nathan. He kept a low profile, staying out of sight and avoiding the areas where Bennett's face was plastered on billboards and newspapers. Every headline seemed to scream about the fire, the dramatic rescue, and the hero who had saved the politician's daughter. But none of them mentioned Nathan by name, and for that, he was grateful. The streets were colder now, not just because winter was setting in, but because Nathan felt a growing sense of dread creeping in. He couldn't shake Riley's warning from his mind. Bennett wouldn't just let this go. He would come calling eventually. And when he did, Nathan wasn't sure what he would do. Marcus tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes and keeping the conversation light, but even he could sense the tension building. Nathan's refusal of Bennett's offer weighed on them both, and the streets had become a more dangerous place since the fire. The scarred man and his crew were still lurking, waiting for an opportunity to strike, and the city's darker elements seemed to be closing in. One evening, as Nathan and Marcus sat around a small fire they had built in an alleyway, trying to keep warm, Marcus turned to him, his expression more serious than usual. "You've been quiet," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Nathan stared into the flames, watching the flickering light dance across the walls. He wasn't sure how to explain what he was feeling, the storm of emotions and uncertainty that had been building inside him since the fire. "I don't know," Nathan said finally. "I guess I just feel trapped." "Trapped how?" Marcus asked, his tone gentle but curious. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Everything that's happened with Bennett. It's like I'm caught between two worlds. I don't belong in his world, but I don't know if I belong here either. I feel like I'm stuck, and no matter what I do, I can't get out." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I get that," he said, "but you don't have to carry all of this alone, man. I've got your back." Nathan glanced at Marcus, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I know, thanks." The warmth of the fire offered some comfort, but the unease in Nathan's chest remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't avoid. And he was right. The next morning, as Nathan was making his way through a quieter part of the city, a sleek black car pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, and to his surprise, Charles Bennett's face appeared from inside the vehicle. "Nathan," Bennett called out, his voice carrying an air of urgency. "We need to talk." Nathan froze, every instinct telling him to walk away. But something in Bennett's tone stopped him. He hesitated, then slowly approached the car. Bennett opened the door, gesturing for Nathan to get in. "Please," he said, his expression earnest. "This is important." Against his better judgment, Nathan slid into the passenger seat, the door closing with a soft thud. The air inside the car was warm, a stark contrast to the cold streets outside, and Nathan suddenly felt out of place, like he didn't belong in this world of luxury and power. Bennett wasted no time getting to the point. "I've been looking for you," he said, his tone serious. "I know you refused my help before, but I need you to reconsider." Nathan frowned, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "I already told you, I don't need your charity." "This isn't charity," Bennett said quickly, his eyes locking onto Nathan's. "It's something more than that, something bigger." Nathan raised an eyebrow, unsure of what Bennett was getting at. Bennett leaned forward, his voice lowering. "The fire, there's more to it than you realize. I can't get into the details here, but it wasn't just an accident. Someone wanted that building to burn." Nathan's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Bennett's expression darkened. "There are people in this city who don't want to see change. People who benefit from keeping things the way they are. corrupt, broken, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to stop anyone who tries to change that. Nathan's mind raced, trying to process what Bennett was saying. It didn't make sense. The fire had seemed like a random tragedy, but now Bennett was implying something more sinister, something planned. "I'm trying to make this city better," Bennett continued, his voice full of conviction. "But there are forces working against me. Powerful forces. And I need someone I can trust. Someone who isn't part of their system. To help me." Nathan felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He had spent so long trying to escape the system, trying to live on his own terms, and now Bennett was asking him to dive right back into the very thing he had been running from. "I'm not the guy you're looking for," Nathan said, shaking his head. "I've got my own problems to deal with." "I know you're not perfect," Bennett said, his tone softening. "None of us are, but you've already proven that you're willing to do the right thing, even when it's hard. That's exactly why I need you." Nathan stared out the window, his mind swirling with thoughts. Bennett's offer was tempting, in a way, an opportunity to do something meaningful, to be part of something bigger than himself. But it also felt like a trap, a way to pull him deeper into a world he didn't belong in. After a long moment, Nathan turned to Bennett, his eyes hard. "What do you expect me to do?" Bennett met his gaze, his voice steady. "I want you to help me expose the people behind the fire. Help me take them down." Nathan's heart pounded in his chest. This was more than he had bargained for, more than he was prepared to handle. But deep down, he knew that walking away from this would mean turning his back on something bigger than himself, something that might finally give him the redemption he had been searching for. Nathan sat in the passenger seat of Bennett's sleek car, the weight of the politician's words settling heavily on his shoulders. The quiet hum of the engine and the warmth of the car contrasted sharply with the cold streets outside, but the comfort did nothing to ease the storm brewing in his mind. He had never imagined he would be here, caught between two worlds, one where he was a ghost on the streets, invisible and forgotten, and another where a powerful man was asking for his help to expose corruption and conspiracy. Bennett watched Nathan closely, his eyes sharp but patient. "I know this isn't what you wanted," he said, his tone softer now, almost sympathetic. "But you're already involved whether you like it or not. What happened that night wasn't just a tragedy. There are people who made sure that building burned, and they'll keep doing things like this unless someone stops them." Nathan's thoughts raced as he stared out the window, watching the city blur by. How had it come to this? All he had wanted was to survive, to stay hidden, to avoid facing the ghosts of his past. And now, he was being pulled into something far bigger than himself, something that could change everything. "I don't know if I can do this," Nathan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't in years. His life had been about avoidance, avoiding responsibility, avoiding pain, avoiding his past. This was the exact opposite of what he'd been doing for so long. Bennett leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but not unkind. "You saved my daughter's life, Nathan. You've already shown more courage than most people in this city. I'm not asking you to take on the world alone. I'm asking you to stand with me and help bring the truth to light." The sincerity in Bennett's voice cut through Nathan's defenses, and for a moment, he felt the tug of something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. A chance to be more than just a man running from his own guilt. A chance for redemption. But with that hope came fear. Fear of failing again. Fear of being used by someone more powerful than he could ever be. Fear of being dragged into a world where he didn't belong. "What if I can't do it?" Nathan asked, his voice thick with doubt. "What if I'm not the man you think I am?" Bennett didn't flinch. "Then we'll figure out together. But you can't run from this, Nathan. Not anymore." Nathan swallowed hard, his mind churning. The temptation to walk away, to disappear back into the shadows where no one would expect anything of him, was strong. But Bennett was right. He was already in too deep. Turning back now would mean living with the knowledge that he could have made a difference and chose not to. He glanced over at Bennett, whose gaze hadn't wavered. There was no deceit in the politician's eyes, no hidden agenda that Nathan could see. Just a father who wanted to make the city safer for his daughter. A man who needed someone like Nathan to help him do it. Nathan's decision crystallized in that moment. He couldn't go back to the life he had been living, not after everything that had happened. If there was even the slightest chance that he could make things right, that he could bring some justice to a city that seemed to be crumbling under the weight of its own corruption, then he had to take it. "I'll do it," Nathan said, his voice steady now. "I'll help you." Bennett exhaled, relief washing over his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You won't regret this." Nathan wasn't so sure of that, but he nodded, knowing that once the decision was made, there was no turning back. He had chosen his path, and now all he could do was follow it to whatever end awaited him. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Bennett had been right. There was more to the fire than anyone had realized. The investigation revealed a network of corruption that reached deep into the city's infrastructure. Safety codes had been ignored, bribes had been paid, and those responsible had covered their tracks well. But with Nathan's help, Bennett was able to uncover key evidence that pointed to the individuals who had orchestrated the fire. It wasn't easy. There were sleepless nights, tense meetings, and moments when Nathan wondered if he had made the right choice. But each time doubt crept in, he reminded himself of Lily's face, her small hands clutching his shirt as he carried her through the flames. He had saved her once, and now, in a way, he was saving her again by making sure those responsible for the fire couldn't hurt anyone else. Bennett's gratitude was genuine, but as the investigation progressed, Nathan began to notice the toll it was taking on the politician. The threats started small, anonymous letters, phone calls in the middle of the night, but soon they escalated. Bennett's office was vandalized, and there were whispers of people in high places who weren't happy with what he was doing. One evening, after a particularly long meeting with Bennett's team, Nathan and Bennett sat in the politician's office, both men exhausted but determined. "You're making a lot of enemies," Nathan said, his voice heavy with concern. Bennett sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know, but this is bigger than me. If we don't stop them now, they'll keep doing this, over and over again." Nathan nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility that had fallen on both of them. It wasn't just about the fire anymore. It was about something much larger, a battle for the soul of the city itself. As they sat in silence, Bennett's phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at the screen, his face paling slightly. Without a word, he handed the phone to Nathan. It was a text message, a simple but chilling warning. "Back off, or you'll regret it." Nathan's stomach twisted, the gravity of the situation becoming all too real. "They're serious," he muttered. Bennett nodded, his expression grim. "They've been trying to scare me off for weeks now, but I can't stop. I won't." Nathan felt a surge of respect for Bennett, but also a growing sense of dread. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't realized just how dangerous it would become. The people they were up against weren't just corrupt, they were willing to go to any lengths to protect themselves. And now, Nathan was in the crosshairs too. The night was cold, a biting wind sweeping through the empty streets as Nathan made his way to the meeting point Bennett had arranged. The investigation had reached its peak, and they were ready to expose everything. The evidence they had gathered was enough to take down the corrupt officials responsible for the fire and bring justice to the victims. But something didn't feel right. Nathan's instincts, honed over years of surviving on the streets, were screaming at him. He had tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut, but as the wind picked up and the shadows grew longer, he couldn't shake the sense that something terrible was about to happen. He reached the small, dimly lit parking lot where Bennett had asked him to meet. The place was deserted, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Nathan's breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he scanned the area, his nerves on edge. Then, he saw the car, a sleek black sedan, parked just on the edge of the lot, its headlights off. Nathan's heart skipped a beat as he approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. He could see a figure sitting in the driver's seat, but the windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who it was. "Bennett." Nathan called out, his voice echoing in the quiet. The car door opened, and a man stepped out, but it wasn't Bennett. Nathan's blood ran cold as he recognized the scarred face of the man who had confronted him in the streets. The same man who had tried to claim the territory where Nathan had been staying. Only now, he wasn't alone. Two other men stepped out from the shadows, their faces twisted with malice. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he backed up slowly, realizing too late that he had walked into a trap. "You didn't really think you could take us down, did you?" The scarred man sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Bennett's a fool, and you're just as stupid for trusting him." Nathan's mind raced, searching for a way out. But the men were closing in, and he was unarmed, outnumbered, and alone. "Where's Bennett?" Nathan demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The scarred man chuckled darkly. "Bennett's not coming. He's been dealt with." Nathan's heart sank. "What did you do to him?" The scarred man shrugged. "Doesn't matter. He's out of the picture now. And so are you." Nathan's mind raced, adrenaline surging through his veins. He had to think fast. He couldn't let it end like this, not after everything he had fought for, not after everything Bennett had risked. With a sudden burst of energy, Nathan lunged at the nearest man, catching him off guard and knocking him to the ground. The other two men reacted quickly, rushing toward him, but Nathan was already moving, his instincts kicking in as he dodged their attacks and fought back with everything he had. The fight was brutal and desperate. Nathan's body ached with every punch, every blow that landed, but he refused to give up. He couldn't. Not now. Just as one of the men swung at him, Nathan ducked and grabbed a broken piece of wood from the ground, using it as a weapon to fend them off. His movements were quick and precise, but the men were relentless, closing in on him from all sides. For a moment, it seemed like it was over. Nathan was on the ground, his vision blurred, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. The men loomed over him, ready to deliver the final blow. But then, out of the darkness, came the sound of footsteps. Bennett. He appeared from the shadows, his face pale but determined, holding a small pistol in his hand. "Enough," he shouted, his voice firm. The men froze, their eyes widening in surprise. Nathan took the opportunity to scramble to his feet, his body aching, but his resolve stronger than ever. Bennett stepped forward, his eyes cold as he aimed the gun at the scarred man. "This ends now." The scarred man sneered, but there was fear in his eyes. "You think you can stop this? You don't have the guts." Bennett's hands shook slightly, but he didn't waver. "Try me." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the scarred man backed down, signaling for his men to do the same. Nathan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding as the men retreated into the shadows, leaving him and Bennett standing alone in the cold night. "Are you okay?" Bennett asked, lowering the gun. Nathan nodded, his body sore but his spirit unbroken. "Yeah, thanks." Bennett gave him a tired smile. "We did it, Nathan. We got the evidence. We can bring them down." Nathan nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. They had won, but the victory came at a cost, and as they stood in the empty parking lot, Nathan knew that this was only the beginning. The city was still broken, and there were still people out there who would do anything to keep it that way. But for the first time in a long time, Nathan felt like he was part of something bigger. He had found a purpose, and he wasn't going to stop fighting, not until the city he had once sworn to protect was truly safe again. The victory in the parking lot was short-lived. Nathan's body still ached from the fight, and Bennett was visibly shaken, despite his brave front. They had exposed the men responsible for the fire, but the repercussions were far from over. The city was still gripped by corruption, and the forces they had crossed weren't about to let their defeat go unanswered. In the days that followed, Nathan kept his head low, trying to avoid the eyes that were now on him. News of the conspiracy had broken, and while Bennett had survived the initial retaliation, the underworld that controlled the city was vast and ruthless. Nathan knew better than anyone that the fight wasn't over yet. He walked the streets cautiously, every shadow feeling like a potential threat. He had gone from being invisible, a ghost haunting the city's forgotten corners, to a man who had drawn attention he didn't want. His mind was constantly alert, always scanning his surroundings, always waiting for the next attack. But it wasn't just the external threats that weighed on him. Inside, He was fighting a battle of his own. The memories of the fire that had destroyed his life still haunted him, and despite his recent actions, the guilt had never fully lifted. He had saved Lily, yes, but it hadn't erased the lives lost in that other fire years ago. His failure still hung over him, a dark cloud he couldn't escape. Nathan found himself wandering late at night, unable to sleep. The streets were quieter in the early hours, and for a while, he could almost pretend that things were normal, that he wasn't involved in a fight for the city's soul. But even in those quiet moments, the ghosts of his past followed him. One night, as he walked through the same streets that had once been his refuge, he found himself back at the scene of the fire. The charred remains of the building were still visible, a blackened skeleton against the skyline. It was a grim reminder of everything that had happened, of the lives lost and the danger that still lurked beneath the surface of the city. Nathan stopped in front of the building, staring up at the ruins. The memories flooded back. The heat of the flames, the screams of those trapped inside, the feeling of helplessness as the fire raged out of control. He could see their faces again, the firefighters who had trusted him, who had followed his lead. And he had failed them. His chest tightened, and he felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing down on him. It was suffocating, an unbearable burden that had haunted him for so long. And now, standing here, it felt like nothing had changed. No matter what he did, no matter how many lives he saved, he couldn't undo the past. He sank to his knees, the cold pavement pressing against his skin. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotions. The grief, the guilt, the pain, it all crashed over him like a wave, pulling him under. His breaths came in short, ragged gasps, and he buried his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though there was no one to hear him. "I'm so sorry." The city around him was silent, save for the occasional distant sound of traffic. The world had moved on, but Nathan had been stuck in this moment for years, unable to move forward, unable to forgive himself. He stayed there for what felt like hours, lost in his grief, until finally, the cold began to seep into his bones. Slowly, he stood, his legs trembling beneath him. He glanced up at the ruins one last time, the weight of the past still heavy on his shoulders. But as he turned to leave, something inside him shifted. It was small, almost imperceptible, but was there, a flicker of acceptance. He couldn't change what had happened. He couldn't bring back the lives lost in that fire. But he could choose what he did next. He could choose to keep fighting, to make sure no one else had to suffer the same fate. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. Nathan's decision to keep fighting wasn't one made lightly. It had taken him years to reach this point, to realize that he couldn't run from his past forever. The fight to expose the corruption in the city wasn't over, but for the first time, Nathan felt like he was facing it with clear eyes. Bennett, despite the threats and the danger, had continued to push forward with the investigation. The evidence they had gathered was enough to bring charges against several key figures, and the city was starting to take notice. The public was outraged, demanding accountability, and Bennett had become a symbol of the fight against corruption. Nathan, on the other hand, had remained in the shadows. He had no desire to be in the spotlight, no need for recognition. But he continued to work behind the scenes, helping Bennett where he could, gathering information, and staying one step ahead of those who wanted to silence them. As the investigation grew, so did the danger. Bennett's office had been attacked twice, and there had been several attempts to intimidate him into backing down. But the politician remained steadfast, refusing to be bullied into submission. Nathan admired his resolve, though he couldn't help but worry about the toll it was taking on him. One evening, after another long day of meetings and strategy sessions, Nathan found himself sitting with Bennett in his office. The two men were exhausted, but the end was in sight. The trial for the key figures responsible for the fire was set to begin, and with the evidence they had, it was almost certain they would be convicted. "You've done a lot more than you ever had to," Bennett said, breaking the comfortable silence. He leaned back in his chair, looking at Nathan with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "You didn't have to stay involved in this, but you did." Nathan stared at the papers in front of him, his mind wandering back to the moment he had rushed into that burning building to save Lily. That had been the moment everything changed, the moment he stopped running and decided to fight back. "I guess I just couldn't walk away," Nathan said quietly. "Not this time." Bennett smiled, though there was weariness in his eyes. "You've helped more than you know. And not just me or Lily. This city, it needs people like you." Nathan shook his head. "I'm not a hero, Bennett. I'm just trying to make up for the mistakes I've made." "Maybe," Bennett replied, "but you've done more than that. You've given people hope." Nathan didn't respond. The word hero still didn't sit right with him. He wasn't doing this for recognition or glory. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. Because, after all the years of running, he had finally found something worth fighting for. As the trial approached, tensions in the city reached a boiling point. Protests erupted in the streets, demanding justice for the lives lost in the fire, and the media was in a frenzy, covering every development in the case. The corrupt officials who had orchestrated the fire were finally being held accountable, and it felt like a victory not just for Bennett and Nathan, but for the entire city. On the day of the trial, Nathan stood outside the courthouse, watching as the crowds gathered. He stayed back, not wanting to be part of the spectacle, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had played a role in bringing these men to justice. The trial was swift, and the evidence was overwhelming. The guilty verdicts came quickly, and the corrupt officials were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The city had won a small victory, but it was enough to give people hope that things could change. After the trial, Nathan slipped away from the courthouse, not wanting to be part of the celebrations. He had done what he set out to do, but there was still more work to be done. The city was far from perfect, and there were still people who needed help. As he walked through the streets, the cold wind biting at his skin, he thought about everything that had happened. The fire, the fight with Bennett, the confrontation with the men in the parking lot. It all seemed like a lifetime ago, and yet it had only been a few months. Nathan wasn't sure what came next. He didn't have a plan, didn't have a clear path forward. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. The guilt that had weighed him down for so long had lifted, if only slightly. He had made a difference, and that was enough. As he passed by a playground, he heard the sound of laughter. He glanced over and saw a group of children playing on the swings, their voices filled with joy. And among them, he spotted Lily, her blonde hair shining in the afternoon sun. She looked up and saw him, her face breaking into a wide smile. She waved, and for a moment, Nathan felt something warm bloom in his chest. He waved back, a small, quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Redemption hadn't come easy, and it wasn't complete, but it was a start. And for Nathan, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support the content. We'd love to hear from you. What part of this story had the most impact on you? Was it Nathan's journey toward redemption, the fight against corruption, or one of the key turning points? Let us know in the comments below. Also, we're always looking for new story ideas that captivate and resonate with you. What stories would you like to see on this channel next? Whether it's tales of resilience, thrilling adventures, or emotional journeys, your suggestions help shape the content we create. Drop your ideas in the comments, and we might just turn your suggestion into the next gripping story. Thank you for watching, and we can't wait to share more with you.